All right, folks, let's go to Washington now with CBC's Katie Nicholson. And I do also, before I throw to you, Katie, just mention some breaking news, because at the top of the show, I mentioned that Stellantis in Windsor, Ontario is going to shut down its operations for 2 weeks directly because of these tariffs coming in from the U.S. president. Well, we've now got an update from Stellantis operations in the United States. They've just put out a wire saying 900 U.S. employees are in Michigan and Indiana are going to be temporarily laid off due to idling plants in Canada and Mexico. So already, less than 24 hours after that announcement, we are getting hit with 900 people being laid off just in the United States, and who knows where it goes from here. So with all of that in mind, Katie, let's walk through again for people at home what came out of the announcement from Donald Trump yesterday. Let's talk about his global expansion of this trade war.
Yeah, I mean, Stellantis is a great example. There is no doubt that President Trump and those charts really upended the global economy. So today, his team is out there trying to defend the plan as markets plunge. And I guess they're going to have to counter things like those Stellantis layoffs. So Caroline Leavitt, the White House press secretary, called this a golden age for America. She's out there saying that the more than 180 countries that are named in these tariffs, they have been ripping off America for 70 years. Here's a little bit of her trying to put a spin on how this is going to not necessarily, I guess, impact everyday consumers, trying to really push forward to the long-term goals and economic agenda of this government.
To anyone on Wall Street this morning, I would say trust in President Trump. This is a president who is doubling down on his proven economic formula from his first term. And the United States of America is no longer going to be cheated by foreign nations around the world. And as the president declared yesterday, this is indeed a national emergency.
So Leavitt there sort of talking about the markets, which are down globally, and really sort of throughout that interview kind of skirted directly answering questions about how this is going to immediately impact the cost of living for a lot of Americans, and sort of, again, pushing to those broader economic platforms. And that's exactly the same strategy that we saw Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick use on CNBC this morning, also stressing the gains for the U.S. They're going to be in the long term, in the medium term, not really talking about what the short-term pain is going to mean. And here's Vice President J.D. Vance selling the agenda on Fox this morning.
We've seen closing factories. We've seen rising inflation. We've seen the cost of housing so high that most Americans can't afford to buy a home right now. President Trump is taking this economy in a different direction. He ran on that, he promised it, and now he's delivering. And yes, this is a big change. I'm not going to shy away from it, but we needed a big change, Lawrence. We cannot keep going down the Joe Biden globalist pathway where we have $2 trillion of peacetime debt and deficits. We have manufacturing disappearing. That is not working for Americans.
And then there is the tariff man-in-chief, the president this morning posting on Truth Social that the operation is over. The patient lived and is healing. The prognosis is that the patient will be far stronger, bigger, better, and more resilient than ever before. Make America great again. So let's just go back to the Rose Garden announcement yesterday. So this was an across-the-board 10% tariff on imported goods, and some countries were hit much harder, including allies in Europe and Asia, harsher than some analysts had expected. And there are also criticisms as to how haphazard some of these tariffs appear to be, and some really bizarre targets, right? So you take the herd in McDonald Islands near Antarctica. To be clear, the only inhabitants there are penguins, and they were hit by a 10% tariff, which would be funny if all of this weren't so serious and the chaos around these tariffs weren't so serious. There is really confusion around the end game here. So how does this fit in with the administration's end goals? Is this a permanent economic policy, or is this some sort of an opening to negotiations? And that was a message that was sort of tracked last night by Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, urging other countries to take a breath, not immediately retaliate. But of course, businesses here are just bracing for higher costs almost immediately. Just consider a restaurant here in the U.S. So you're buying coconut oil from Thailand. Well, that's now hit with a 36% tariff, 36%. So what would that do to the business's bottom line? How is that cost going to be borne? Does it go to the consumer? How is that going to go over then with Americans who are already pretty ticked off about affordability and the cost of living? These are sort of the ramifications and the fallout that the Trump administration is really going to have to get ahead of and try to push back against.
There's so much that remains unclear still at this moment, Katie. And one of the things is that there's this sense that Canada wasn't on the list, so it's okay. But that's not, in fact, the case, because the president in that executive order did make it quite clear that there would be a 25% tariff on almost all goods and 10% on energy and potash if Canada does not meet the requirements of the CUSMA or USMCA agreement. So just walk us through on that, because there's also been some pushback from the U.S. Senate. What are you seeing?
Right. So that initial wave of tariffs that came in under that national emergency sort of order, that act that the president tried to use, using fentanyl coming across the northern border as a sort of a justification, that sort of was being pushed back on. There was a resolution from Tim Kaine, a senator from Virginia, who's a Democrat, that was co-signed by Rand Paul, senator from Kentucky, who is a Republican, basically questioning whether or not the president should have used that order, seeking to limit the use of that power and really sort of roll back that first wave of tariffs. And surprisingly, that managed to pass in the Senate last night. So 4 Republican senators with states with those close geographic or economic ties to Canada broke ranks. And this is even after they were name-checked by President Trump in a social media post. So we're talking about Susan Collins from Maine, Mitch McConnell from Kentucky, Lisa Murkowski from Alaska, and of course Rand Paul from Kentucky. And Paul was really a bit of a firebrand on the floor last night. I mean, he usually is, but he really let fly with his distaste on tariffs ahead of that vote. Here's a little bit of that tape.
Tariffs are a terrible mistake. They don't work. They will lead to higher prices. They are a tax, and they have historically been bad for our economy. But even if this were something that was magic and it was going to be a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, I wouldn't want to live under emergency rule.
Now, of course, this still isn't really expected to go anywhere. The House Republicans are hoping to be able to fend off this specific resolution. But there is another one that's sort of bubbling up. This one is coming from House Democrats. There's a strategy from a New York representative named Greg Meeks. He wants to introduce a privileged resolution, which is basically going to force a House vote over tariffs. It's kind of a procedural move, and you can use it to try to bypass leadership in the House and force votes. So that is something to watch for. Again, that isn't necessarily going to go anywhere. The president made clear yesterday he was going to veto anything like this that came across his desk. But what it does do is it does force House Republicans to stand up and say where it is that they stand on tariffs in this moment that is maybe increasingly fraught.
Katie Nicholson in Washington. Thank you, Katie. And Trump's move has put global markets on a free fall. Let's turn to CBC's business host, Scott Peterson, who's joining me in studio. So, Scott, everybody's watching this. How bad is it at this point?
It's terrible. Markets are just saying this is the worst thing that they've seen since protection-wise from the U.S. economy since the 1930s. And global markets are really reacting to this global trade war that is now upon everyone. And to show you how serious it is, and the markets are a litmus test for truth, after all, $2 trillion in market value has been wiped away from these markets today all by themselves. Let's take a look at some of what's going on out there as far as these are businesses, these are individuals betting with their money. We're seeing the Dow Jones now at session lows, 1,500 points off it. So it's about 3.5% to the downside. We're seeing the same thing with the S&P 500, the high-flying NASDAQ exchange, and the TSX as well is down severely. We've got the price of oil down $5 a barrel. We have the Canadian dollar, the Mexican peso, unusually up against the strength of the U.S. dollar. And when we dig into this, we're looking at a whole range of manufacturers that are getting anybody that does deals with overseas markets. For example, Vietnam, Indonesia, and China with the tariffs imposed there. We've got Lululemon down about 11%. Nike's down over 10%. We've got Under Armour down 8%. Apple does a lot of their manufacturing in China. Those shares down 8%. That represents $255 billion of investment market cap just been wiped out. And it's not just manufacturers, it's also the big heavyweights, the financials in the U.S. like JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, Citigroup, and on and on. Walmart's down about 2%. We've got Dollar Tree down 11%, and it goes on from there. Citigroup says that this a 54% tariff applied to China will be the biggest penalty that China has experienced since the First World War. We're also seeing everyday consumers expecting to pay on average about 23% more based on a $2 trillion or $3 trillion worth of imports that the U.S. has every day. But the big part here Natasha, is the uncertainty. Derek Burlington, the economist from TD Bank, sort of outlines, particularly in Canada, how this uncertainty is really going to affect business investment here.
It's uncertainty right now. I think investors in Canada, companies are worried. And so while we escape the new additional tariffs, it's still going to be a challenging period for Canada as companies kind of navigate through very uncertain global waters as they look to where they're going to invest their next dollar.
That's part of the problem here is if any business investment out there, they're thinking, do we set up shop in Canada? Do we set it up in the U.S.? And probably they'll be setting it up in U.S., and that's going to hurt Canada down the road.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Scott.
Thanks, Tasha.